As you can see, we have our technician getting everybody wired up before we all get fired up around this discussion on public school reform this evening. All right, is everybody ready? I want to, first of all, say good evening to all of you. And on behalf of the Organization for a New Equality, the Mellon Bank / Boston Company, the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, welcome. My name is Charles Stith. I'm the National President of the Organization for a New Equality, which is really driving this process around public school reform, the summit which we'll be holding over the next couple of days. What we're going to be involved in this evening is an open discussion on public school reform. So the podium is absent. The scripts are absent because we do want this very much to be a dynamic process. We've got some very distinguished folks sitting up here this evening who are prepared to get us going in this discussion, but we do want all of you to participate as well. First of all, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Brown Henderson. Cheryl. Cheryl is the Executive Director and founder of the Brown Foundation for Educational Equity, Excellence, and Research. Ms. Henderson is one of 3 daughters of the late Reverend Oliver L. Brown, who in the fall of 1951, along with 12 other families, filed suit on behalf of their children against the local Board of Education. That case made its way to the Supreme Court, and on May 17, 1954, became known as the landmark decision, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Ms. Henderson has been an educator for 24 years, serving as a classroom teacher, a guest lecturer, a school guidance counselor, and a vocational equity specialist for the Kansas State Board of Education. In 1988, Ms. Brown, along with a co-worker, started the Brown Foundation. Since its establishment, this organization has provided scholarships to minority students, presented awards to local, state, and national leaders, and sponsored programs on multicultural understanding for some 2,000 people. Ms. Henderson was one of 4 women named 1994 Kansan of the Year. Also joining us this evening, to my far left, is Harry Spence. Harry is no stranger to many of us who are based in Boston, but he's been the Deputy Chancellor for Operations for the New York City Public Schools since October 1995. Mr. Spence administers an $8 billion budget and more than 1,100 school facilities affecting 1.1 million students. His responsibilities include the school system's budget, financial operations, school facilities, food and transportation, information systems, and human resources. Mr. Spence has an extensive senior management background in both the public and private sectors. His administrative talents have turned around public institutions in extreme distress and driven complex projects for established companies. Before moving to New York, Mr. Spence acted as the receiver for Chelsea, Massachusetts, a post to which he was appointed in 1992 by Governor William Weld. In his capacity as receiver, he assumed the executive and legislative powers of municipal government for this city of 30,000 people, including restructuring operations, creating an aggressive economic development program, and enacting municipal charter reform. To my immediate left is Ms. Mary Beth Vanderweel. She was named Chief Investigator of the Chicago Public Schools in September 1995. She is charged with weeding out corruption, theft, financial mismanagement, and child abuse perpetrated by staff in the city's 550 public schools. Her office has pursued more than 1,500 cases. Prior to becoming a member of the Chicago Schools new management team in July 1995, Ms. Vanderwilt was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. It was there that she wrote about corruption in the public schools. And just to make the obvious connection, she did such an excellent job, they recruited her then to help clean up the mess. Ms. Vanderwilt is also an author of a book, Reclaiming Our Public Schools, The Struggle for Chicago School Reform, 1994. She is the recipient of a number of journalism awards and has appeared on many television and radio programs in Chicago and across the nation. And our final guest this evening is Maria de Los Angeles Montes. She is the principal of the Lucy Stone Elementary School in Dorchester, Massachusetts, right here in Boston. Since she took over the school in 1991, enrollment has increased from 138 to 250 students. Ms. Montes turned the school around by working to make parents actively involved in the school and in their children's education, and reaching out to form partnerships with private businesses and community groups, among those being the John Hancock Corporation, the YMCA, the Urban League, the Kennedy School, the Codman Square Coalition, and UMass Boston. Ms. Montes has overseen a complete building renovation effort specifically adapted to meet her school's needs, increased technology funding, and added new programs and classes such as extended day for kindergarten students. Students' test scores have climbed over the years as innovative reading and writing programs created by her staff have gone into effect. Last year, the Stone School received the Private Industry Council's Best in the Class Award. These are primary participants in this discussion. Here they are, here we are, and we expect you all to get fired up. The first question that I want to throw out here this evening is one that you'd expect in a discussion around public school reform. The average American, if asked what they think of public education in America today, would probably say something along the lines that it is in deep, deep trouble. What do we need to do to fix public education in America? Don't all speak at once.
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I think it has to start with creating a will to educate our children. And I think I'm going to speak from the Chicago perspective. For many years, that will has been lacking. How else can you explain allowing school buildings to lapse and disrepair over decades with leaking roofs? How else can you explain a teacher assignment system in which many thousands of teachers don't get assigned until October in the school year? How else can you explain a system that lacks just basic common sense, such as pulling the troublemakers out of the schools and putting them in highly structured boot camp settings, private structures? How else can you explain a system that had no automated attendance or truancy programs, et cetera, et cetera? I think what you really need to do is to start with a will and then bring a lot of common sense to the system. In Chicago, many of the things that we're doing are so very, very basic. One of the first struggles I had coming to Chicago Public Schools was getting mailboxes for my employees, much less email. And I'll have to say that after a year of effort, we finally do have email in my department, and something that is just basic to private industry is a luxury in the public school systems. So much of what we're seeing, we cut over $1 billion out of a 4-year budget. We made an agreement with our teachers union that would guarantee us labor peace and stop the years of teacher strikes and financial crises. We instituted a system which makes so much sense that requires students who don't meet certain educational levels at 3rd, 6th, and 8th grade to go to summer school. I mean, it came down to a really basic question is why are we allowing kids in 3rd grade to go on to 4th grade if they can't read? And yet this social promotion has affected our public school systems across the nation. And I think it's rooted in low expectations. And so we really need to increase the expectation for our children, roll up our sleeves, and just get to work. And that's what we're trying to do in Chicago.
I want to add to that because I agree. So the best way when you agree with someone is just to jump on the end of their statement. One of the things I think concerns me, which is why I agree about the lack of will, is the fact that society seems to have forgotten that public education is still our best resource. It's where we develop the next generation. It's where we teach responsibility. It's where we teach individuals how to be participants in America. Being an American is not a spectator sport. It requires certain levels of knowledge, certain basics, certain literacies. And I think we've forgotten that public education right now is the best we have for preparing the masses to participate fully. I think, on the other hand, we know how to fix it. But we're so busy looking for scapegoats that we're not looking for solutions, or we're not willing to implement the solutions. There's no mystery. This is not rocket science. Yet because of the lack of will, I think is what is causing us to suffer. The other thing I have to mention, though, having been a classroom teacher, because I'll be the last person to bash classroom teachers, believe me, so that won't be happening out of my mouth tonight. Teaching is a very hard job. It's probably the hardest job in this country or on the globe. And unless you've been there, you cannot fathom what a person goes through emotionally and in other ways in a classroom, and the responsibilities that are on your shoulder as a public educator. But I say that because I think we've also lost respect for those among us who have the hardest job. We've lost respect for those among us whose responsibility is much greater than the bank president or the superintendent of a district. We've lost sight of that. And I think the folks that are on this panel will clearly illustrate the fact that we need to start at certain levels. Money's important. Figuring out a better way to finance public education. I think we also need to look at perceptions, because I think that when you look behind the perceptions, you'll find more examples of the introduction here about how schools are turning themselves around. So I'm pleased to see that we're having this discussion tonight to give us a chance to praise public educators while we talk about ways to come up with solutions.
So you raised a number of interesting points. I mean, a number of interesting points. The scapegoats, what's required to fix public education in America is not rocket science. And before we explore some of those, let me let you two guys jump in here too. I mean, on the initial question, what's wrong with public education in America?
Well, I actually think that while it's true that, in a sense, the application of common sense and political will is central to this, and as these systems have become increasingly complex, in fact, the organizational infrastructure hasn't kept up with the complexity. And so, in New York, we have a system that is characterized, in fact, by how few systems there are in it. And we've been doing a lot of the same kind of work of trying to put in place very basic systems. At the same time, I think we need to recognize that its brokenness is not broken. The system's not broken in the sense that it's not doing what it used to do, because in fact dropout rates in the 50s were as high as they are today. The difference is that in the 50s you dropped out of high school and you got a job. If you got a job in industry, you could make a living wage. Today you drop out of high school and you have absolutely no prospects for employment whatsoever. So that even as we talk about rebuilding public education, I think we have to recognize that the rebuilding is not just a rebuilding, it is a genuine reconstruction in which we have to learn something quite new, which is how, in fact, to educate children for a 21st century economy. And that is a very, very much more demanding task than these systems have ever been asked to do before, I recently, about 10 days ago, spent much of a day in District 2 in New York, District 2 in Lower Manhattan, under the leadership of Tony Alvarado, who people in Boston know because he was a candidate for superintendent of schools here, and an enormously impressive one. that district is probably further ahead in the development of what's called standards-based education than I think any any subsection or section of urban schools in this country. And it is astonishing to see what's occurring in classrooms in District 2. In 4th grade, kids being pushed to think at a level of conceptual, at a level of generalization, and at a level of abstraction that lots of kids in the last 100 years have gotten all the way through high school without ever being asked to do. We're not going to be able to educate children for the 21st century by, in fact, filling them full of facts and making sure that they can do well on multiple choice tests, because they'll fail in the workplace. So I think we need to recognize that there really are two things simultaneously going on here. The rebuilding of the infrastructure, while we simultaneously enormously ratchet up standards, which I also think reflects a our finally outgrowing the notion that the task of public education is to sort children by, quotes, innate ability. And instead, we at long last recognize, and I think there's a growing consensus around this, and the standards movement is built around it, that innate ability is remarkably little variation in innate ability. That what we really need to do is to be educating all children to high standards, because all children can learn to very high standards. But it means that our pedagogy, the structure of the classroom, daily classroom behaviors, expectations of teachers and the like, have to fundamentally change in many instances. There are lots of teachers doing this kind of work, and they're doing extraordinary work, but there are tens of thousands in New York alone for whom this is going to represent a whole new way of doing the business of education. And that's that invention of, this is the restructuring of a system while we invent what a 21st century education truly is.
Let's hear from the principal.
Oh, yes. I thought I was going to have to fight again. I do agree with what all my colleagues have said here, that, first, the economy of the world has changed, and it has changed so rapidly, and we're just trying to play catch up. And that is a reality. The social structure of our nation has also changed. And we have to admit that it has changed so rapidly that we are again trying to win a race that is, a tough one. I myself, from my own experience, the first thing that when I came to the Lucy Stone School, I found that the teachers were not following these economics changes. And that's one of the reasons why I worked very hard to get a business partner into the school, to work together as team members to show us what was happening in that business world, to sit down, to teach them what was like to be in a school. And it was a big learning experience for these business people too. But for us, it was also to learn from them. Their own expertise was essential, but also for them to learn what was happening in our world. So together, we formed teams. We learned from them, they learned from us. And I think that was, an eye-opener for my teachers, because they were not aware that this big race, it was a tough one, and we needed to win it. And I think that this is the major problem that we have lost track of how the economic issues have affected the schools and also the social structures. Our society is completely different. We find, like Cheryl said, teachers dealing with many, many problems today that my teachers never dealt with. So we find that in a school, a teacher has to be a social worker. And I'm just going to mention quickly, last year I had a young first grader in school. I'm going to name him Michael. Michael was an adorable child. He was reading at second grade level. But when something would snap, Michael would jump all over the tables, the chairs, and it was worse than chasing a rabbit. What was wrong with Michael? He was barely 6 years old. Michael had been in 11 foster homes. You tell me how this child could stand living in 6 years in 11 foster homes, when all of us adults know that even just switching homes, after living 3 years or 4 or 5 or even 10 is a tough situation for some of us. At least I think so. The emotional stress on the teacher for this child was horrible. Even visitors, even the superintendent who came to visit us, could not believe that when Michael read a beautiful story to him, the story's name was "What is Home?" That was the title of the story. And he chose the story. I'm going to read for you. He took the book, he opened the book. It was many stories in the book, but he chose the story, "What is Home?" So you place a teacher with 28 children, 28 lives in a small room, and those lives are going to be there present every single moment.
But Harry, you wanted
Well, I wanted to jump in on this because I think a big piece of this really speaks to the system of teacher education. And there are a couple of aspects to that. I think it is similarly way behind where the economy is and where teacher education needs to be. Simple piece, we're working like fury to develop the use of computers in the classroom. And we know we have to retrain teachers who've been teaching for 20 and 25 years. But what's really shocking is that brand new teachers coming out of good teacher training programs can walk into the classroom with no knowledge of the use of technology in the classroom, just to take a small example. I'd take your case as a case of another piece, whereas I think which is about excessive specialization. The separation of the world into general education and special education has meant that a whole set of skills that special education teachers know about behavior, addressing problems of behavior in the classroom, for example, don't get taught to general education teachers. I heard a wonderful story of a school in the Bronx that's doing something that I can't remember actually the term, but it's essentially a mainstreaming program. Although, as the person who was consulting to them said, the critical thing is not getting the kids, the special ed kids and the general ed kids, to talk to each other. It's actually to get the special ed teachers and the general ed teachers to talk to each other. Because what happened in this school, there was great alarm in the school and in the community about special ed kids moving into the school, a belief that disorder was going to break out in the school. But what in fact happened as a result of special ed teachers teaching classroom management skills to general ed teachers that they'd never learned, to everybody's astonishment, this mainstreaming in fact produced a more orderly and a more settled and quieter school, because general ed teachers were learning classroom management skills that in 20 and 25 years no one had ever sat with them to teach them. This issue comes up all the time when I talk to principals about teachers coming out of school, out of schools of education. One of the things that's routinely, utterly left out of the curriculum is fundamentals of classroom management. So I think we've got to look at both we've got to look very seriously at the teaching of teachers in this country and move really hard, just as we're talking about moving up standards in the classroom in primary and secondary education. In order to do that, we have to move up standards in the schools of education in the long term. And that's going to be a battle that we're going to need to take on very soon. We're beginning to crank up for that in New York right now. Because for every failing public school in New York, there's a failing university that is teaching teachers for a lost world, for a world that bears no relationship to the teaching of public education today.
When somebody looks at this group, they see a kind of broad expanse of experience and perspective. You all have articulated quite eloquently most of the critical issues relative to what's wrong with the schools, and done it quite well. let's come back to this issue of will. I mean, you all get it. I mean, you understand, what needs to be done. You understand what's wrong. What has really kind of mitigated the will of America to deal with this issue of public school reform? I mean, we've got folks who talk about choice, which appeals to that kind of individualism, that spirit of individualism that is America. But choice doesn't get to all of these cases. Why did America lose the will? And this is an open discussion. There are a couple of mics around here. You can move to a mic, or if you want to use your preaching voice, and can stand where you are and speak loud enough to be heard, certainly do. Frank?
My name's Frank Jones, and I think that America began to lose its will back in the 50s. I went to Chicago Teachers College. I taught school in Chicago for a number of years. I graduated in the late 50s, and I started teaching about 4 years after Brown. And that became, when I first started teaching, the schools were pretty much integrated. The schools in Chicago where I taught, although you had your neighborhoods, but I taught right on the border. So you had black kids and white kids and Hispanic kids and Asian kids all going to school together. The people in the city were concerned about education in those days because their kids were in the school system. As soon as we began to implement Brown, you began to see the populace in this society move away from public education, all the way from the extreme of academies in Mississippi to everybody in private schools in other cities. And so the investment in education by our public policy investment in education, in my judgment, began to be reduced and diminished at that point. At the same time, I used to be a member of the National Education Association, and all the people that I went to school with were members of the National Education Association. And we thought that teaching was perhaps the most noble profession you could go into. My compensation, and I genuinely believe this, was watching young minds grow and helping these kids. I used to go to their homes at night, take on kids as tutors from other schools. And other teachers did that as well. But then there came a time when, out of New York, as it were, there was an organization called the National Teachers Association, not the National Teachers Association, the
American Federation of Teachers.
Shanker's group.
Al Shanker's.
Yes.
And teachers, recognizing that financially they had been exploited and weren't being respected, or being respected less every year, began to join the labor union, really. And working conditions and salary, of course, are the major issues of labor conditions. At the same time that the society was beginning to continue to disrespect teachers. I think we got to this place because we disinvested, both in terms of fiscal resources, but more importantly, this notion of will. Disinvested in terms of will for public education in this country. And the first job, it seems to me, we can talk about the curriculum and the subject matter of teaching, but before you can ever get to that, you've got to go back and try to create in our society a value for school system, for the schools, and for education. I've seen in Boston, for example, the exploitation of our schools, the misinformation of our schools, so that any constituency of the school system was undercut enormously. Even for people who were trying to do the right thing, they were trying to do it the wrong way. They were doing it by blaming the teachers and the kids, and they disinvested in our schools. That's happened, not just in Boston.
Just the ground rule, Harry, and we're going to let you get in. Anybody else that has a comment or a question that they want to raise, you need to use the mic so that we can pick it up for the television. We're live on the internet tonight. How about that for technology along with education?
I'd like to.
Sure, let Harry, and then we've got one person over here.
Well, much of what Frank says I agree with, but I came to education 1.5 years ago, because I'm really new to this field, with sharing much of that belief until I began to read the numbers about investment in public education. And the truth of the matter is, it's fairly distressing for one who believes in public education, because in the last 30 years, we've increased the national investment in public education by 50%, adjusted for inflation. We are spending 50% more today on public education than we did 30 years ago. What is also true is that much of that money has been poorly applied by the systems. It has not gone into the central focus of classrooms. It's gone into everything but the business of education. And I do think the public education system has to take some responsibility for its failure to use what in fact has been a very dramatic increase in resources applied to the problem and shown not enough. The single most impressive result is the narrowing of achievement scores between students of color and white students. And there is some significant achievement in that, though nowhere near what one would, A, have wanted after Brown versus Board of Education when you think of the history that preceded it, nor nowhere near as much as one would have expected such an investment to produce. So I think the public education system has the public, I think, lost its confidence that dollars invested in public education could produce real change in the classroom. I think today we know better. We've learned in the last 10 years a great deal more about what works. And I think what we now need to do as public education systems is prove, and I think we can do it, that there will be real improvements in student achievement measured, yes, by standardized test scores, because it's the measure the world uses right now, and we'd best go on that one, but also I think on many other measures as well. I think we can prove that increased investment will in fact result in strong outcomes. But we've got to make that case and have not done well in the last number of years.
Cheryl, you had a point that you wanted to make earlier.
Yeah, several things. First of all, I wanted to respond to the comment he made about teacher education, because one of the reasons we're involved in the business of giving scholarships, and we give scholarships to minority students who want to become teachers, it's because so many universities in this country graduate 0 students of color out of teacher education programs. When you think about the pre-Brown era and the post-Brown era, one of the defining factors for the achievement, and Brown was not about achievement. Let's not get confused here. It was not about African American students being able to achieve because they were sitting next to white students at all. It was about something much greater. I'll go back and revisit that. But let me go back to this business about 0 teachers. Pre-Brown, one thing that was so significant about the successes of the early scholars and all of the folks that achieved during that era is that their teachers were African American. Now, in our community, in the Brown v. Board of Topeka, the African-American teachers in those 4 segregated black schools held more advanced degrees than their white counterparts. There were no other outlets for that education. We had PhDs and master's level people teaching elementary school because they couldn't get jobs in the white schools. So I guess it's important to note, and it was so significant that you brought up the fact, that after Brown, all of this began to happen. I want to share with you this whole litany of things that I believe were the unanticipated legacies of Brown. Brown, in fact, was this country's second Reconstruction, no more effective than the country's first Reconstruction. We need to remember that. Brown was not uniquely about public education. Brown was about getting society to get off the mark with Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. Even though schools were chosen as the battleground, they were not singularly the ultimate aim of what Charles Houston and the other attorneys in Brown wanted to come out of that. And it's interesting that we sit here at Harvard University, talking about this when in fact Charles Houston, the person that is credited with killing Jim Crow and bringing us to where we are, received his education after a really unholy experience in this country's military of facing down a lynch mob of fellow white soldiers. There's so many social issues. Let me just run down this litany, and then I'll relinquish the floor to my colleagues and other cyber people, since we're on the internet. But there's this whole litany of unanticipated. My parents and all the other folks involved in Brown could never have anticipated the response of the country. I think the country is still in a response mode. When you think immediately after Brown, what happened in the U.S. Congress? Southern elected officials got together, wrote the Southern Manifesto, and said they were not going to comply. Congress did this, folks. That's why people like Governor Faubus felt like he could close schools. He had the weight of Congress behind him. That's why people in Virginia closed public schools for 4 years, because they had the weight of Congress behind them. And let me just run down the unanticipated legacies of Brown. First, white flight. Secondly, the antiquated system of school finance, school closings, school boundaries that create barriers, majority of African American students remaining in segregated schools, magnet schools, shortage of African American teachers, the Bakke case with its claim of reverse discrimination, African American male academies, busing as a tool for integration becomes unacceptable when it had been acceptable as a tool for segregation, withholding of resources of time, attention, and money. But the most insidious unanticipated legacy is the continued attempt to show that somehow African Americans just are not capable of academic achievement. When you think about books like The Bell Curve. And unfortunately, that wasn't the first. It seems like every 30 years or so, those kinds of books resurface. But I think we need to, there's so many different things we're talking about. We're talking about with our newcomer to education, you know, the fiscal issues and some of the technical issues, but education is still about the heart and soul. So I still think first and foremost, we need to talk about the sociological aspects of what needs to be different.
I'd like to follow up on the teacher issue. Certainly the unions deserve a lot of credit for giving teachers the financial respect that they deserve. And I'm a big believer in teaching is such a precious profession, as you agree, and I've seen teachers touch lives, hundreds of lives. But I've also seen the worst of the worst, and it is very, very distressing to see teachers in our system who we can't get rid of, teachers who you and I would never, ever put our children before. I had a teacher recently, and a group of parents came and complained about this teacher, and the teacher was saying, well, you're just illiterate parents. And they said, guess what? You taught us 30 years ago. That's why we're illiterate. And, you know, we had a teacher in our office putting voodoo spells on us. We had a teacher recently reinstated after distributing the Iowa Test of Basic Skills to every teacher in the school in advance of the achievement test, even though every test says, do not distribute, do not copy. I mean, it was a test cheating scandal that raised scores extraordinarily, but certainly not ethically. That teacher was reinstated. We had another teacher who was running gambling rings with the students, and the judge says, well, I can't believe that any teacher would be this stupid. You know, we see teachers, and that's just, you know, we had another teacher absent 1 out of every 5 days for 5 years, and when he said he had been drinking 20 bourbons a night and therefore was disabled, he was put back into the classrooms. I think when you talked about the union did bring a lot of respect for financially, but it also, by its refusal to address the bad teacher issue, has done a whole lot to discredit a very precious profession. And I think we need our unions, and again, who I have a lot of respect for. I don't want you to think, you know, I don't have any respect for what they've done. But in that one issue, we need our unions to step up to the plate and realize that these bad teachers affect thousands of children, and they turn them off to education for the rest of their lives. And so I think that's a really, really important issue, and it ties into your issue. I mean, I'm talking even beyond those who have lack of training. I had one teacher who told me if the teachers in her school were required to take a 5th grade test, Iowa Test of Basic Skills, to retain their jobs, her school would be wiped out. So I think that it's an absolutely essential issue, and we have to put it all together. We need to support our teachers with discipline, technology, supplies, but we also need to get rid of the bad ones.
You've talked about the symptoms, the outcomes of this lack of will. Frank, you hit on a point. You had a point that you wanted to make, Richard, a moment ago. You were at the mic. But let's come back to this question of will. Why have we lost the will? And then we'll come over here to this side.
Okay. Actually, it was a footnote to the point of political will that I wanted to make. I come from Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's a city where we've recently lost the accreditation at our high school. And we've discovered that there is not a member of the school committee who has their kids in the public schools. There is one member of the city council who is Hispanic. He has his kids in the public school, but no other member of the city council, of which I'm a member, I have no kids of school age, have their kids in the public schools. But I think it goes further than that. In the last session of the legislature, no chairman of a House or Senate committee in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had their kids in public school. No constitutional officer elected by the voters of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had their kids in public school. These are the policymakers of the Commonwealth. I do not know how far and wide this sample goes, but I suggest to you, if it goes very far at all, we have a very serious problem that must be addressed at the ballot box.
I would just like to say that it is my opinion, I'm David Evans, I'm a college admissions officer. It is my opinion that the public schools, the solutions thereof, are a moving target. And it is unfortunate that so many, and I think Mr. Spence addressed that, tend to direct ourselves at right now, and right now becomes yesterday, and that we're going to solve this problem, and all of a sudden it's last year's solution. The other is that the system is adversarial. It is very much like law enforcement. It is very much like civil rights. It is adversarial. And those persons who are the best advocates, the most vigilant, are those who wrench from it some kinds of solutions. In many ways, we benefited from, and I don't like to use those words like oppression, but we benefited, as Dr. Henderson, from persons who were overqualified. 50 years ago, we took Eddie and Mary down to a school at 6 years old. We gave them to the system and returned 12 years later and got a finished product without any intervention on our part. And we went away thinking that is the way, that's what education is. Well, that was not what education was. That was benefiting from some persons who had master's degrees and PhDs who should have been a third-line manager at IBM instead of being the teacher there if they wanted to. And we went away thinking that is what education is. The same way as when we had Charlie Houston as the lead lawyer at the NAACP. We thought that the best black lawyer on this earth should be the chief counsel for the NAACP. That isn't as it should be. It is a moving target. We must readjust and say that education means, from Latin, educo, I lead out. It does not mean putting anything in. And instruct means I build on, instruo. It has nothing to do with putting anything in, leaving something with them. It is my responsibility to pull it out of these children and to build it on. It is a moving target, it is adversarial, and unless we get involved, then it's going nowhere.
How much is the issue? Let me just throw this out here, because you know, maybe I'm hearing something and maybe I'm not. How much of a factor is this issue of race in this whole matter of the will? You know, our schools in urban America over the past 30 years have gotten blacker and browner, and these seemingly intractable problems have increased along with that trend. Is race a factor?
Yes.
That is part of my question, Reverend Stiff. My name is Joseph Washington, and I'm the pastor of St. Luke's United Methodist Church, and I also have the pleasure of being a board member of one. And my question is connected with your question, Charles. We have in our public school systems in urban America over 80% minority kids. Our teachers are just the opposite. It's almost 80% or 85% white. So I'd like to throw that out to you about the will. And I'm from Arkansas and grew up in a segregated system in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, but the will was there. And it seems like throughout the decades since Brown, the will has lessened, and part of it is unfortunately due to race.
I can speak for Chicago and some of the research that I did for my book, and of course some of you have lived through this. The system started to decline in the 1960s when hundreds of thousands of families and a couple 100,000 people moved up from the South, and many of them were African American. At that time, the system reacted not by absorbing them in an equitable way. The schools became overcrowded in the minority communities. Those children went on half-day shifts. They got the substitute teachers. They got the shortages of books. They got the worst science equipment. And I really believe that began the cycle, because until then you had many of the the minority and the white students educated equally and going forward. But at that time, I mean, when you consider that many of the minority students were receiving a half day of education, substitute teachers because of the teaching shortage, inferior books and supplies, it started creating a very serious cycle. In addition, the system made a decision to allow a third of their teaching force to become permanent teachers, even though they could not pass a basic competency exam. And the statistics from the time show many of those teachers went into the minority communities. And to me, that was, you know, an absolute indication that race played a very big factor.
The gentleman over here on this side, let him get in and come
This
back.
might divert the conversation a little bit, but we've been talking a lot about some of the problems and the theoretical problems. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm a volunteer at the Lucy Stone School, so I've gotten to meet Mrs. Montez a few times. I actually think that hearing the story of how she turned the school around will teach us all quite a bit about how to fix these problems in a concrete way, and might take the discussion to a few more specifics. And I wanted to ask Mrs. Montez if she felt comfortable doing so, to talk a bit about the partnerships she formed and the road that led to the Lucy Stone School being a great institution.
Thank you. See, this is what makes a difference, you know, and this is what I think sometimes it's needed, the commitment from the whole community. We cannot do it alone, and unless we have more people committed to education and coming into the schools, instead of pointing fingers and saying they're bad, the teachers are not doing their job or whatever, or let's forget about them and find the private schools, you can't turn things around. And I have, like the students of the Kennedy School of Government, UMass students that come to the building, and many others that when they visit the building, they say, something excellent is happening here. But what I say, and it's very, very important, is that we need to start dialoguing. That dialogue, and that's the D, the ABCD, that we need to enforce here, is that we all have to start talking to one another to see how do we turn things around. Where is the commitment from the community? There is no way that we are going to make things happen if we cannot get everybody's commitment in this job. When we have the volunteers coming to the school, they know that they're appreciated, that there is a very important role that they play, not only as role models, you know, especially when they're young students, graduate students, but also because they're going to assist. Ben, when he was today, there was a substitute in the classroom, and he went and helped the students to do something today. When he came out, he said, I know that the regular teacher is not there, and I appreciate how she maintains that class on a day-to-day basis. And I think it was an eye-opener, right, Ben? I want to say a little bit about these issues about race, because I am in a school where it's mostly minority. We have 14% white, which is, you know, pretty comfortable. It's mostly the area. It's an integrated area in the neighborhood. It's Cadman Square in Dorchester, but it's also the courthouse area where all the action goes all day long. And, you know, it's in a crime, very high crime, let's put it that way, also section of the Dorchester neighborhood. But, you know, it's mostly minority children. My staff is half and half. It's about 50% white, 50% minority. I'm Puerto Rican. Others are from the islands. Some are older, some are younger. I have a good balance of older, seasoned, experienced teachers and the ones that are learning. But when you have people working as a team, those barriers can be diminished. I think Mary Beth was asking me, is any teacher there that you would get rid of? And I said, no, I have a dream team. It took me a while. It took me a few years to achieve that, but I'm very comfortable saying I have a dream team. And the issue of race, I have to say honestly, and you can go to my school, I'll fight you if you find that this is something that strikes you as an issue. Our children, we believe they're achievers. We have some children who come from the islands whose parents don't even speak English. You know, we have Haitian kids who are reading at 8th grade level, who never stop picking up a book. And you meet their parents and they barely can speak a few words of English. So I think, you know, when people start supporting, and when we all come to the table and dialogue, all these things can happen, and all these things can be overcome, even including the issues of race and of social classes or any other cultural differences. I'm sorry, I am a believer in education. I am maybe very positive. I am an optimist because I have seen results, and I've seen maybe in my case teachers who were at some point also had lost the spirit of fight when seeing that their school was almost being closed. When I came to the school, the issue was the school was going to be one more year standing, and the next year it was going to be closed because those enrollments had been going down year after year. And those teachers' morale was very low. At that moment, it was a matter of sink or swim. We swam together. And it was also finding the community behind us and the community giving us credibility. And that started with dialogue. And I think that this D has to be emphasized. We can all see, you know, a lot of issues, a lot of problems, including race, including all the social problems that our children bring to the schools. But unless we all say, let's dialogue, let's look at the solutions, we're all going to find that we're going to get stuck. And I think we have to go beyond these problems and look for the solutions.
Let's go out to this mic, and then Harry will come back to you.
I wanted to introduce along your alphabet theme, C, the notion of competition and choice has been introduced in recent years. In some ways, I think a response to the concerns and problems of the public school system. And by that I mean the introduction of charter schools, the introduction of vouchers. Does the panel believe that this notion of competition and choice has been counterproductive or positive?
If you don't mind, actually, I'd like to jump back to the earlier question that it seemed to me and maybe come back to this issue.
Okay, because I think this is an excellent point that we do need to come back to.
The obviously, about the role of race in all of this, and let me just talk a little bit about the experience of a small city outside of Boston called Chelsea, Massachusetts. When I arrived in Chelsea in 1991, Chelsea had one of the worst school systems, maybe the worst in the state. Its physical plant for its schools was far and away the most dilapidated in the state. Chelsea had not invested a single dollar in new capital construction in 60 years. And it had far and away the worst physical plant in the state, and its schools were dismal. The effort to build new schools in Chelsea clearly focused quickly around a very central issue. The folks who controlled Chelsea politically were white and working class and middle class, by and large. The kids in the schools were Hispanic and Asian, a smattering of Afro-American, and a tiny, tiny number of whites. As we pushed on the question of building new schools, it was very clear that for a very significant portion of the voting population, which tended to be overwhelmingly that portion of the population that had been there for many years, that they had no interest, in fact, were very clear, didn't want to invest in schools for kids who were, quotes, not our kids. Why invest in these schools for kids that are not our kids? Now, what strikes me as ironic today is that it's now 1997. The schools opened in the fall of '96. The property values in Chelsea are skyrocketing. They're skyrocketing because of new schools. And finally, after a sort of fitful and uncertain start, BU actually got down to the business in their contract with the Chelsea school system to manage the system, got down to the business of actually improving education in Chelsea. And today, people are dying to move into Chelsea because of its extraordinary school system. The beneficiaries are those same homeowners, who refused to vote for dollars for schools in Chelsea because they're, quotes, not our kids. So I think race is absolutely central to this equation. I don't think it can ever be made as simple as simply the statistics and demographics of teachers and students. And I think we know that, although that certainly is an important indicator, though we can't make it as reductionist as that. Boston University, with clearly a strong white presence in its leadership, no question, as it moved into that school system, nonetheless, in this instance, had the will to turn that system around. And a group of Hispanic and Asian kids today are reading, I saw the most recent scores, 85% of kids in the elementary grades, I believe, are reading at grade level. That's a pretty good record for a public school today, 85% reading at grade level. And they expect to see that rise. So race is central to it. The solutions can't ever be as simple, I think, as simply saying, well, therefore, we need to segregate the teaching force. That's not the solution. But it does seem to me this question of will is linked to whether or not the political elites across boundaries of race and class genuinely understand the identity of interest between themselves, the children of the community, their own future, and the future of their society. At the turn of the century, New York City built what probably was, up to that point in time, and with all of the exceptions around issues of race that we would agree on, nonetheless was the most democratic and egalitarian mass system of education the world had ever seen. Built it out of a massive immigration that occurred at the turn of the century, and built an extraordinary public school system for all of its failings. Built it at a time when there was a strong identity of ethnicity and faith and other ties of community between significant portions of the New York financial and political elite and the new immigrants. Key question for New York today is, when there isn't that identity between the city's elite and the students in its schools, can it develop the will? Will it develop the will to genuinely assure the achievement of every student in public schools in New York? I think, actually, the signs are beginning to be more hopeful around that question. But there's a ways to go, and we've got a lot to prove yet before we know the answer to that.
The point was raised. Let's come back to it. Choice, competition. Are they helpful to this whole matter of public school reform, or are they part of the problem?
Well, I think choice and competition has always been there at some level. So we don't want to think it's something so revolutionarily new, because initially, in many instances, African Americans before integration were educated in private schools, because those were the schools that made themselves available to them. In our state, they were called charity schools, until the influx of African Americans got so great that the charity schools couldn't keep up with the requests for enrollments. So it's not necessarily so new, because we all know there's really nothing new under the sun. It's a fact that it's been in the recent political debate, and it's part of the discourse about declining public education and therefore giving parents more opportunity and more choice. People seem to feel as though if choice is on the table, in a major way, in a voucher kind of way, that will force public education to take a closer look at the types of teachers within its four walls, the types of programs, the types of outcome, and all of the things that seem to be going wrong with public education. Now, I, for one, because Brown was about choice in large part, I don't know that I have a problem with allowing choice to run its course, because I've been through many, many educational reforms in my career as an educator, and each one of them has had to run its course. I think choice is going to have to run its course because I think it has supporters. And as long as something has supporters, as long as people can give you chapter and verse of how this is going to be so much better, it simply needs to run its course. I don't even know that we should fight it. I think we should let it happen. You know, we should watch it and let it run its course. I do want to, before others comment about choice and private schools and all of that, talk about the dialogue issue, because I do think that that is critical, and it also goes to the heart of what was being said about the success in New York and the success in Chelsea. People have to talk, and sometimes the will is created by court order. In our community, we're currently under court order to segregation and have built 3 multi-million-dollar magnet schools, and they're succeeding in terms of balanced enrollment. But it's also forcing the district to ask the community to come and talk to it about what kind of curriculums, now that we have this nice mix, you know, need to be put in place. Those of us who don't have children in public school any longer, and I'm one of them, have agreed to participate in some of that dialogue. We've got people from a cross-section of the community, some of whom have kids in private school, but they're willing to talk about how their tax dollars are being used in a public setting. And unfortunately, the will has to be imposed sometime, and the court orders can be the instrument of that. Or sometimes the will is imposed simply because it's too embarrassing not to impose the will to sit down and have the dialogue. But that's where it starts. Because back in the 50s when we talked about, and I want this gentleman to ask his question or make his comment, he's been standing a long time patiently, but after that, the country did fall short in that there were no massive attempts at in-service for the educators that were already there. You know, at best, some school districts said, well, to white administrators, you have your first African-American teacher. What you should do is you call the white parents of prospective students to see if they're comfortable with this whole idea of white students finally having African-American teachers. Having been an African-American teacher, I know that for white parents, you know, through the 70s when I taught, it still became a question mark about my ability, you know, to communicate with and to teach their children. I had to fire a room mother because she didn't want me at the parties. I mean, it gets to be that petty. I convinced her that I could buy cookies and punch as easily as she, and I didn't need her services because I had the legal responsibility for those children and had to clearly be present at the party. So, you know, it runs so deep with some people, but the dialogue, I think, is in fact critical to making any substantive changes.
Right, come on.
Thanks. I wanted to make a couple of comments. Seems that my first comment was provocative. I wanted to say that the question that you ask is as large as all outdoors, as we used to say in Mississippi, and as complex. The issue of what we spend on education has become a major issue since, frankly, since the school population, the population of the schools of our country has changed. The demographics in the school has changed. That has become a major issue, just as choice has become a major issue. So that I think that all these things, you asked the question, is race an issue? Race is now and has always been a major issue in education for minorities in this country, and I speak specifically of blacks. I grew up in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s and I graduated from high school in Chicago after having gone 1 year. I came to Chicago when I was 11th grade to the west side of Chicago, and this was in 1948 and 1950, and I went to Chicago Teachers College, which is now Chicago State University. But my point is that the education that was being provided in the ghettos then isn't very much different than when the education is being provided now, because the teachers were the same kind of teachers that we have here. That is to say, on the west side of Chicago, teachers were, you know, they came after the change in the public school system in the population. They came to school and people told me that I shouldn't even talk about going to college. When I went to a counselor, when I went to McKinley High School, which is now an elementary school, said you shouldn't talk about, you should try to get yourself a trade or try to get yourself a job out of Continental Can. And they were right. Continental Can was where people worked. I worked at the post office for years. Sitting next to me was a man with a PhD, a black man with a PhD and a lawyer who had graduated from Georgetown. There weren't any jobs, David. That's exactly right. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that if we're going to solve this problem, we really do have to define it, and we have to define it honestly. The reason that there's been disinvestment in education is because the change in our demographics in our cities across this world, across this country. And finally, Harry, I just want to say that looking at the dollar figure that they used in this city and actually undermined any credibility for the school administrators and any constituency for the schools by saying we were spending $7,500 per student on education. And what you saw when that happened was that everybody in the city, particularly in the communities that didn't want the integrated schools, said, what are they doing? They're wasting this money. Look at these people. They don't know how to run these schools. When in point of fact, much of that money was being spent for the kind of social service needs that kids had who came to the schools. So we have to be honest about what we're spending the money for. It was not being spent for education, it seems to me.
That's right. All right. Listen, I would agree. Al.
I'm not an educator. I'm a private business person who spends my own money to help children in the system move along. What's really wrong with the system is the lack of leadership, not will, lack of leadership from the top, from the school board, from the mayor, from the governor, from those folks who really have the power to make change, but they like to deal with things that are easy, that are quick, that they can get some good press for, and that the press comes easy for. What they don't want to deal with are the hard things in life. And education is hard. Why is it hard? Because the folks in this country who are in charge of education, in many cases, aren't educated. And that does not necessarily mean a degree, but they aren't successful in their own right. Being on the school board is the greatest thing in the world for them. This is the height of their life, to have been appointed or elected to the school board. Do they care about the school system? No. They care about their own personal gratification and their own position in the community. So until we get leadership, and I take it from a business perspective, if we had the same type of leadership in business in America that we have in the school system, we wouldn't have any American businesses. The businesses would be run by the Japanese, the Chinese, the Germans, and some other folks. Americans wouldn't run businesses if we ran them like we do the school system. If we chose leadership that was inept, not qualified, not oriented and committed to the position in which they chose. So until we get to the vote, which my good friend here talked about, and putting the right people in leadership positions for the right reasons, and then making them perform as leaders in the community, and when they don't perform, 2 years later, 3 years later, out of here. The next thing that covers that, and we talked about choice. Choice is a Band-Aid. That's a patch. That's a drug or a couple of aspirins here we give to people to say, I'm going to solve some of these problems. I'm going to get some folks on the amen bench over here who are going to vote me back in. So I'm going to take care of those folks. That's easy. I talk about this easy thing, which may or may not ever happen, but I don't care because it sounds good in the press, it looks good on the front page, and I get reelected. So until we, as members of the community, voting members of the community, use our vote for other than popular election of folks who want to get out here and say they want to do things, hold them accountable for what they do or don't do, we will continue to fight this internal struggle between educators, principals and superintendents, teachers who are trying to do the right thing, but aren't being led. And their leaders are beating up on the folks who are trying to deliver. I spent 25 years in the Army, so I can talk about soldiers at the bottom here and generals up here on the hill with their glasses looking over the battlefield, watching soldiers get killed. Generals don't get killed because he's too far back. He's behind where the longest cannon will shoot. The same thing with our leadership here in the school system. So let's take on the leadership rather than beating up on the little folks here who are just trying to do the job, the best job that they know how to do.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes and 36 seconds and counting. I want all of the folks who joined us for this discussion up here, and let's give them a round of applause. They've done an absolutely marvelous job. In a minute and 30 seconds apiece, I want you to share with us whether you think we're going to be able to turn this thing called public education around in America and why you think we're going to be able to do it.
Well, I want to serve as I wanted to comment that he is correct, that leadership is in fact part of the problem, because leadership does in fact dictate the will of the masses. And I say that because this summer I ran for office, and the interesting thing to me about that is that if you notice that people espouse politically in terms of campaigning what the majority of the voters want to hear, the people that are really going to vote, not the majority of people that believe certain ways, but the ones that are actually going to show up at the polls. Choice was popular. Choice was something that the various coalitions, without naming names, were going to turn out to vote for. So I think it's important to note that. One of the things I mentioned on the campaign trail had to deal with the fact that I thought President Clinton's idea of putting federal money into infrastructure, into those districts where they knew the tax base was very poor, considering school finance, was an excellent idea. Now, I was chastised by one of the newspapers that was deciding who they would endorse, and their one complaint with me was the fact that I believe that federal money should be used for infrastructure. Now, think about this. These are the same people that when federal money comes down to your state for highways and bridges and other kinds of infrastructure issues, nobody complains. You don't hear a peep. But when it came to infrastructure for students, and majority students of color in the kinds of districts where they needed that little boost to repair their schools, it became something that was just heinous. And how on earth could I even pay lip service to the idea of using federal money to improve the kinds of schools that have been described here? So I do think we shouldn't forget that our vote does matter, and that it is in fact the leadership that drives the will. But I do think that what's going to happen in terms of the short term is going to be the kinds of things that have happened at model schools that we've heard about tonight, one district at a time.
I actually am very hopeful about this equation right now. I think we're going to turn it around the same way, in fact, that failed schools have turned around. A group in New York just looked at a series of schools that had failed in New York that have managed to turn around in the last several years, and said, what are the common ingredients? And in every instance, the central common ingredients were, one, a change in leadership, and leadership is central, and leadership is centrally about expectations. And it is about leadership that has high expectations of all children and genuinely knows and believes that all children can achieve. It's then about a relentless focus on teaching and learning. It's about staying focused on the central mission of the organization through all of the pushes and pulls in the society to distract us from the fact that schools are to teach children, and all the excuses for why we can't, that we turn aside from all of those and maintain a relentless focus on teaching and learning. And then that everything in the school is aligned towards that. I think what we need to do and are working to do in New York, and I think other systems are working on it, is, okay, we've proven that it can work. And it works in the same way for poor kids of color, or kids whose first language is not English, or kids who've just arrived in this country. It works as well for them as for any other kids. If that's the case, what we need to do is move it to scale. And that's the task. I think we can do it.
I too have a tremendous amount of hope. And Chicago, I've seen things that would have been unbelievable a few years ago. And step by step, program by program, I see things being rejuvenated is very, very difficult because you're constantly walking against the wind. But I also agree that the leadership has brought a will to educate for the first time in years, and I couldn't agree more that it has to start at the top and then go from the bottom up and the top down, bit by bit to restructure. But I have a lot of hope.
Principal, you get the last word.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
She's done it.
That's right.
And I'll go back to the ABCs. And I go accountability for administrators, accountability for teachers, accountability for superintendents, school committees, custodians. I've had big fights with custodian unions. Accountability for the community at large, because it's an investment, and we all are accountable. It's going to be something that we all as a community have to answer for. Best, I say B, but best climate. Not best buildings per se, best climate. Best climate for teaching and learning. So when a child comes into a school, he finds, let's put it that way, quote, heaven, and can leave behind everything that makes him suffer maybe, or puts him on stress. So that's the best climate. And curriculum, C for curriculum, but a curriculum that is connected, a curriculum that is challenging. And then I add the D again, dialogue. We got to keep on talking. I think that that's the most important thing. And we are stakeholders, all of us. We have to make sure that the dialogue continues, or else whoever sees himself or herself on an operation table on 20 or 30 years think that it was one of those students, one of those children. Or if you think when you get to a certain age and somebody's going to push your wheelchair, make sure that who pushes your wheelchair or gives you the pill for the arthritis knows how to read and write and can follow directions.
Right.
Tonight, we've affirmed a deeply held belief in this country, and that is public education is a great equalizer. It's absolutely critical to the attainment of the American dream. Public education is absolutely critical to the health and survival of this nation. You might not have heard it here first, but you did hear it loud and clear, that there is hope for public educational reform. But all of us are part of the solution. Thank you all. Good night. Excellent.
I'd like to visit your school.
Excellent.
I'd like to visit your school.